Homer J. Simpson, you're a genius. I know you like clowns, so I made you this bed. Now you can laugh yourself to sleep.
If you should die before you wake.
Can't sleep. Clown will eat me. Can't sleep. Clown will eat me.
Mature content warning. The following episode contains discussions of child death, child abuse, spouse abuse, hate crimes, homophobia, graphic murder, sexual assault, and most other triggers you can think of. Yes, we are finally discussing Stephen King's It. Spoiler warning for It, Cujo, Pet Sematary in Star Wars Episode 9 The Rise of Skywalker. Enjoy. Or try to anyway.
Welcome to episode 19 of The Horror of Babylon. I'm Ryan, and with me as always is Daniel. Say hi, Daniel.
Hi, Daniel.
And tonight we have a very special guest host, our very good friend Matt. Say hi, Matt.
Hello.
Before we get into it, we're going to do some introductions. Of course, tonight we are discussing the long-awaited episode on Stephen King's It, my personal favorite horror novel. Daniel, one of your favorites for sure.
Top 5.
Yes.
Probably top 3.
And as we've been saying recently on the podcast, we are not covering the entire book in one episode. We are breaking this up into 5 parts. We are going to be discussing part 1 tonight. Before we get into it, we're going to do some introductions. Matt, can you talk to the people a little bit? Tell us what your background is with horror. What do you like? Specific horror movies, games, books? What do you not like about horror? Our last guest went on a tirade against slashers. So if you want to do that, it's been done, but we won't stop you.
Well, when it comes to horror, book-wise, I think it might be the only actual horror book I've read.
Oh, neat.
You play a lot of horror games. Outlast, Resident Evil. Mm-hmm. I mean, you just say you love me.
Yes.
Well, for movies, I still remember the first horror movie I ever saw, and it was Child's Play, the first one. When it, I think I was 6, and I remember hiding under a table. And then I remember the next day, my family at the time, we went to Spencer's.
They're no longer his family.
That's a divorce and etc. and all that. We went to Spencer's, and my older brother at the time found a Chucky doll at Spencer's and chased me around the store with it.
Fun.
And I think for the longest time that scarred me more than it should have. And up to where gremlins scared me. And I would always look out the shower curtain to see if there was a gremlin in the bathroom. But now horror movies don't. I love horror movies. I mean, bad ones, good ones, like Chinese gore flicks.
Oh, those are
foreign,
great.
Just
Tokyo gore flicks.
B-rated foreign horror films. I don't know. Slasher films are okay, but I think I prefer stuff with more suspense, mystery, kind of solvies, all the the Haunting of Hill House and Bly Manor, the Netflix stuff. I know it's not really horror, but it's
I like that stuff.
Supernatural-esque stuff. Yeah.
Quick fire. Best horror movie you've ever seen. Go.
Oh, fuck.
You're thinking too much. Answer.
I don't know.
Okay, you lose. Worst horror movie you've ever seen. Go.
What was that one that we with the
Executive Koala?
I forgot about
No. Okay. I don't know if this counts as a horror movie, but it relates to Stephen King.
Okay.
His son wrote a book called In the Tall Grass.
Yep.
And there's a
They
movie for it.
They wrote that together.
There's a movie for it, and it's fucking awful.
I haven't seen it. I've heard
It's on Netflix, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
I watched the whole movie, and I was like, what the fuck did I just watch?
In the Tall Grass.
It's literally just all these people get lost on the side of the road and just walk into a field, and it's a whole day of them just walking around this field, and then it turns horror, and I have never felt like I wasted an hour and 40 minutes of my life. And I saw the book one day at a Gabe's, and I was like, I'm not I'm not even gonna bother reading this.
Ryan, what's your worst horror movie?
My worst horror movie?
Yes.
X. No, no, it's not the worst. Phantoms was pretty bad.
Phantoms were pretty bad.
I'm sure I've disliked something more than Phantoms, though.
Mine is still Sinister too, because I went to that hoping you'd get scared again, and it was awful.
That's
Did
the
I
movie
go?
I was thinking about.
Where
No,
we
we all went to see. We went and saw both Sinisters.
Yeah. I know. I remember
But I
us
think
seeing
I
Sinister.
think we laughed more than.
Yeah,
Oh.
and the second Sinister.
Didn't I yell at the screen about crocodiles or something?
Yeah, because the crocodile. It was freaking goofy.
Yeah, that one was bad.
Because I think we were all surprised that they got a second one. Because the first one was already like.
I like it.
The first one,
The first one was good, but then the second one came around and was like, okay, we're doing this again?
Yeah, I
Like-
remember. Okay. I guess it was so bad I blocked. Oh, you know what I really hated was the one Pi got kicked out of. The Exorcist.
Oh, the Last Exorcist? I
Yeah.
love the Last
No,
Exorcist.
that was bad. That was pretty bad. I don't know if it's the worst, but it's bad. Okay. Horror, anime, manga, yes, no, maybe?
I mean, anything by like Junji Ito.
Yeah,
or-
we're all Junji Ito fanboys.
I mean,
Yeah. We'll Ito that punch.
I mean, High School of the Dead.
Yeah, yeah.
What other horror ones could I think of?
I'm a
I mean,
big fan.
would you count Gaunt's as like a?
Yeah, I mean, it dances that
Gore.
line.
It's like gory,
It's
like
gory.
it's
Body
pretty
horror.
dark. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gaunt's is-
Higurashi's a big one for me.
Higurashi is good. I mean, anything with a.
I thought of it.
Genre.
Okay, can I re-answer my worst horror one again?
Yeah.
Higurashi.
you can't just buy off the dub.
Okay, all right, let's move on. So, of course, we are talking about it, and like we do when we hit a new book or topic, we like to give a little bit of background about it.
The vampire's a pure myth, superstition. I may be able to bring you proof that the superstition of yesterday can become the scientific reality of today.
So, this book was written over a period from 1981 to 1985. So, he spent 4-something years writing this epic. It was published in 1986. It was written after Cujo and before Misery and the Tommyknockers. This was at the height of his cocaine addiction. So, little Stephen King background. He started publishing in the 70s. At that point, he had a large alcohol problem. You can really see that in novels like The Shining.
Mm-hmm.
But as he became more successful, earned more money, became a household name, specifically in the 80s, especially when a lot of his books started getting film adaptations, he started getting into cocaine. And it is one of the ones that people point to, but the Tommyknockers, to me, is the one that exemplifies his cocaine addiction the best. But another contributing factor to the writing of this book was that he was very depressed about being labeled as a horror writer. His first published work was Carrie. He followed that up with Salem's Lot and The Shining, which are both very traditional horror novels.
Spooky scares.
Vampires, ghosts.
Scary girls.
So, and of course, with all the movie adaptations that were coming out about his books, people were thinking of him as the master of horror rather than like a novelist or a writer. In fact, the same year that it was published, Stand By Me was released in theaters, which is based on his novella The Body, and they downplayed his name. It didn't say in the trailers, based on a book by Stephen King. You really could only tell it was his by watching the credits at the end of the movie. And that was a big contributor to his depression. He was also comparing himself to Clive Barker, which he has said in multiple interviews that he thinks Clive Barker is a better writer and a better horror writer. Some people believe that he intended it to be his last horror novel, where he kind of took out all the stops, took out all of his tools, and just put it into this one large, massive book. It also won the British Fantasy Award in 1987, and I also wanted to mention that Derry is based on the real town of Bangor, Maine, where Stephen King is from, and holds a residence to this day.
When are we taking a road trip there?
So actually, they do Stephen King tours.
Okay.
There's like a little red British-style tour bus, and you can buy it. It'll drive you around town. And a lot of the places in Derry, like the Standpipe, are real places in Bangor, and you can go and see them. And the tour ends by going to his house, and you can take pictures in front of his house.
We're gonna do that.
So yeah, Patreon dollars. We're going to Maine. Woohoo! Yeah,
There's a lot of good stuff in Maine. I mean,
there is. Okay. Yeah, get some lobster, some clam chowder, some oysters.
just don't look down any of the drains.
No. Oh God, no.
Kill you all! I'll drive you crazy and I'll kill you all! I'm every nightmare you ever had. I am your worst dream come true. I'm everything you ever were afraid of.
Okay, so moving on to structure and themes, we're just going to run down some of the themes. We're going to be treating this not with no spoilers. We're not going to be looking ahead. We're only going to be talking about book 1, and the next week we'll be talking about book 1 and book 2. So if you haven't read this before and you're reading it for the first time with us, you don't have to worry about us telling you anything ahead of time. And if Daniel spoils anything, I promise I will edit it out before I publish it. I just want to run down a list of just some of the themes that you come across in this book. Fear, friendship, meta-horror. It's very much a fantasy horror epic, more or so than just a straight horror. Children growing up, coming of age, loss of a child, parents dealing with that. Memories is a big theme. Bullying is a big theme. Daniel, when you think Stephen King's It, what themes are most prominent to you?
Growing up.
Can you expound on that a little bit?
Book very literally had, like, it juxtaposes the kids as they were as children and who they grew up to be. And it even in book 1, it intersplices these little segments of, hey, here's how, Bill got over his stutter. Here's some of the stuff that Ben's been up to. Here's how Beverly has chosen her relationships based off of her childhood. And it really kind of gets to the core of how these things that you experience as children affect the adult you're going to be.
Right. For me, the two themes that I always think of first are fear and friendship. Because it's about Pennywise and how he projects other people's fears back to them, and then the friendship and the cohesiveness of the Losers Club. Matt, what themes jump out to you?
I mean, I was going to say those two, just in general. I mean, if it wasn't for the Losers Club being together, I'm pretty sure
they would have all died.
Bad things would have happened.
Yes.
Because, I mean, there's just so many instances of, they help each other get over fears to help, progress and not, get slaughtered. But, I don't know.
And without spoiling anything to come, bad things do happen in this book. Don't think bad things don't happen.
Bad things happen in the first chapter.
Yes.
The book is way too big for bad things to not happen.
So we're going to dive into each of these themes as we kind of go through our discussion. And before we move on to characters, I just want to talk about a little bit about the structure. This book and the miniseries and the 2 movie adaptations each take different structural approaches to the story. It's actually kind of unique. So when I think of it, I primarily think about the kids.
Mm-hmm.
But part 1 of the book, you don't meet any of our characters as children except for Bill for just a little bit in the first chapter.
Teeny tiny bits.
You actually primarily focus on them as adults in part 1, which if you ask most people to pick, you like the kids or the adults better in the book, most people will say the kids. But part 1 is very strong.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel, what are your thoughts about the structure of this book?
It's honestly one of my favorite books because of the way it's structured. It really builds a lot of sense of mystery when you're getting these adults with these huge gaps of memory that they've lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
and they're kind of rediscovering these horrors that they've went through as the book progresses, and you're getting like a little back, a little forth. In part one, you mostly get them as an adult getting like shell shocked from news. It's almost like if you had a victim of like PTSD or some extreme trauma, be reminded of said trauma.
Which I mean is kind of
it's like
pretty much what happens.
Yeah.
I mean, saying they don't have PTSD is...
Oh, they totally
have it. They have it.
They have worse than PTSD.
I'm pretty sure even in just those small scenes at the beginning, you already get that feeling of like, oh shit, stuff happened. Like
and you want to know what happened, and you get a feeling of that because the first chapter's all of like with Georgie and stuff, so you kind of know what happened to him, but there's like these little hints of individual things that affected them.
Well, that's like one of the things that the book does really well. It makes a lot of books will be like, this is the main character. This is who you're focused on. This book, it does a very good job of being like, these are the main characters, and
bounce back and forth.
And that's including, Pennywise as well. Because
he is the secret 8th member of the Losers Club.
I mean, kind of, yeah. But I mean, I don't know. You're so used to reading books where it's like, starts off happy. Great, you keep reading and then progressing. This one hits you just right in the balls, right at the start, and goes, all right, well, I'm getting into this, and then it flops you back to the start, and you go over it, and then you catch up to where they are, and it does a really good job at just rounding that circle and bringing it all together.
It might be one of my favorite books in terms of its structure, just with how it builds these characters and the mystery around them.
And before we get into characters, I have 2 things that we're going to do first. First, I want us to go around and tell our first experiences, not necessarily with the book, but just with it, the story itself, be it the book or the miniseries or the movies. And Matt, will you go ahead and kick us off? What was your first experience with it?
I'm pretty sure I was at my grandmother's, and it was the movie, because I remember I was younger, and I think it was on, I want to say it was on like ABC. And I remember flipping through the channels, and it was the scene where they're in the library as adults.
Yeah.
And his head, I think it was his head in the refrigerator or something, or somebody's head was in, I can't remember, but they open it, and he's just like in there. And I just remember seeing that and being like, what the fuck? Because I was younger, and I was like, oh, Grandma doesn't want me watching this.
Yeah.
And then, as I got older, I watched the original movie, and then I don't think I read the book until maybe my senior year of high school. Because I was just really into like sci-fi and fantasy, and someone handed me that book. I was like, here, read this, and it's like, okay.
It definitely...
They pull it open their trench coat and go, hey kid,
want this thick ass book?
As I said earlier, it's definitely a horror fantasy. So if you're somebody who's into sci-fi fantasy and you're looking to transition into horror, this is a good touchstone to do that, because it's very much about world building and characters, and more so than just like a spooky, scary story.
I would say out of most horror books, this one is very well, like very sci-fi. Like,
yeah,
if there was a Venn diagram of like horror, sci-fi,
it straddles the line.
It's like in there.
Okay, so for me, the first time I saw it was the original miniseries with Tim Curry. I remember being at a friend's house like Sunday after a sleepover. We're trying to delay me going home, and we're flipping through the TV channels, and it was like, oh, this is really long, let's watch this. And then just having the absolute shit scared out of me.
I mean, yeah, clowns were like, back then as well, were just like scary.
I think
like
the Brave Little Toaster gave me PTSD about clowns.
That's what did it for you, was the Brave Little Toaster.
Yeah, there's like this really like scary...
I don't know, I know the scene.
Yeah.
It would... The nightmare sequence with the fireman clown. Yeah.
I would say like I'm not afraid of clowns, but I think like Tim Curry and like Bill, I can never pronounce the last Skarsgård. They both just portray the character really well. I mean, I love Bill did a fucking insane job.
They're both great
doing that character, but
yeah.
Tim Curry was the nightmare fuel of that age.
So, growing up, that was what I identified as my favorite horror movie, and I still do. When they announced they were going to do a legit film adaptation, which would be released in 2017, I was like, all right, it's time to stop fucking around. It's time to read the book. Read the book. almost put it down and quit like 5 different times.
Did you listen to it while you were at the gym or something?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So the first time I tried to listen to this was before the movie was announced. I was getting into Audible and working out at the gym. I downloaded it, listened to the first chapter where Georgie dies, and decided this is not something I should work out to, and put it down for a couple years. And then they announced the movie, and I said, okay, I need to go back to it. Loved it, totally blew me away, but there were like 4 or 5 different parts in the book that freaked me out so much I just almost stopped listening to it altogether. The movie came out, the second movie came out, and this is rereading or re-listening for the podcast. This is my 3rd time, because I actually listened to it again last year. It's definitely one of my all-time favorite books. Definitely my all-time favorite horror book or Stephen King book. Daniel, what's your history with it?
I watched the miniseries when I was like 9 or 10. Fairly young. Freaked me out a little bit.
So we all kind of had that same.
Yeah. It was one of those. It was one of those movies where people were like, "Oh, it's like one of the scariest movies ever." So I went to like the VHS rental store and got like the big 2
tapes.
And it was
chunky boy.
So thick. I was like, "Oh man, this is gonna be epic." It freaked me out. I was like, "Oh man, a lot of kids die in this."
Because I think a lot of the scary movies at that time were just like slashers. I mean, it was just like the typical.
Yeah.
And something about that was just
it's different than slasher, and I love slashers.
I like slashers, but I generally don't find them very scary.
They're just predictable. Even like at this point in time, like if a slasher comes out in 2022, you're like, oh well, this is gonna happen, and that's gonna happen. There's just a formula to it that people just keep people.
And there's just something kind of special about it, especially with like Tim Curry's performance.
And I think it comes out as the fact that this book and the movies just have an actual story.
Yeah.
Like there's just a concrete floor for them to build off of, and I think that's just what makes it.
Then about 5 years ago, exactly 5 years ago, I started reading the book because I was at the time in-laws' house, and they were boring the fuck out of me. So
they're nice people.
So I took out the book, and I was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna, because I work night shifts, and for some reason people are like, why is Daniel up all night? I'm like, because I work night shifts, and I'm used to being up at like bumfuck 3 a.m. And that's why I'm always asleep when you guys are calling me to do stuff. So they were boring me, so I went and I stayed up all night and I started reading it. At the time, I started my job, and my friend there, Carrie, was also reading it, so we just started reading it together and talking about it.
Yeah, that'd be
That's by pure coincidence.
That's like a book club idea, just having like you and 6 of your closest friends all read it at the same time.
Yeah, no, I would recommend that as a book club.
That sounds great. But it'd be so hard to get 6 other people.
It wouldn't be the first book I would throw at somebody. It's just too thick for some.
Threw something.
You could kill somebody.
Somebody might knock them out.
Yeah.
And then my wife left me, so I just kept reading it to distract myself.
That'll do it.
So then I powered through that book in like 2 weeks because that's all I did was read.
I know that I borrowed it off of your Audible before the first one came, because I think we both read it before the first movie.
Amazon, if you're listening, he's making shit up. I don't loan out my Audible books.
I mean, I bought it. I'll buy it right now, Daddy.
I love it when you say Daddy.
Well, I think I read it because I read it before the first part came out, and then I read it again before the second part came out, because we both went and saw it.
Because I was trying to finish it by the time it came out.
And those new movies are fantastic.
Yeah. I love the first one. I'm not a huge fan of the second one.
Yes, the first. I just the actors they got for the kids are just.
They were very good.
Great. Yeah.
Really good, like, actors.
It was a gazebo.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
All right, so let's go ahead and start talking about some of these characters. And before we get into it, I'm going to talk about how we're going to structure this discussion. So generally when Daniel and I do this, we just make a list of the characters and we go down them one by one. But since we're breaking this up into 5 different episodes, we're actually going to go by the chapters and talk about the characters as they're introduced into the book. And we're going to confine our discussions to that character based on what we know in part 1. And we're going to attempt to not talk about what we know about them based on the entire book.
Yeah.
So just a quick overall overview of what is part 1. So part 1 encompasses chapters 1, 2, and 3 in the first interlude. Chapter 1 is after the flood. It's basically George Denbrough making the SS Georgie with his big brother Bill, going out into the rain to float the boat down the street. Unfortunately, he goes to the cross streets of Jackson and Witcham and meets Pennywise the dancing clown, and unfortunately is murdered. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is after the festival, flash forward 27 years. So that took place in, I forget, it is 1957 or 1958.
Yeah. And
then flash forward to the mid-80s. We're still in Derry, Maine. We meet Adrian Mellon, and this chapter is basically about the murder of Adrian Mellon by some homophobic bullies and how Pennywise is incorporated into his murder. We'll talk more about this specifically when we get to that section. Chapter 3 is really the meat of part 1. 6 phone calls where we are introduced to our first 6 losers one at a time, as the 7th loser, Mike Hanlon, calls each of them and tells them that it, whatever it is, we assume it's Pennywise, is back. That's where we meet Stan, Richie, Ben, Eddie, Bev, and Bill. And then we wrap up part 1 with the first interlude, the first of 4 interludes, which is notes from Mike Hanlon, the 7th loser's unpublished history of Derry, specifically more a history of Derry as it pertains to it and the disappearances of children and other adults. So we're going to go ahead and rewind back to chapter 1, after the flood. The first character we really get the most information about in this book is George, or Georgie Denbrough. Matt, I want you to take it away. What are your thoughts on Georgie?
I mean, poor kid.
Poor kid.
He just wanted to sail his boat. And it's like, it's such a...
It's like every murdered child ever. Poor kid.
It's like even now when I visualize that whole scene, I just see the movie. And the yellow rain jacket, skipping down the road, following his boat, and then just
Slicker and galoshes.
And then I just think to myself, like, if I was a kid, I wouldn't just... If my boat went down the drain, I'd just be like, oh, ship sunk. Like, all right, let's go make another one.
The first thing that stuck out to me on this reread was just, is he 6?
He's super young. I can't remember the exact age.
I think he's 6.
He's
like 5 or 6.
He's in that ballpark, and they
very
just...
young kid.
There's no thought from his mom and older brother. Just let him go out and play.
Yeah, just go out and play.
Like, even I have 2 younger sisters, and even when they were like, when I was living there and they were like 8, I still would, if they went outside, I would be out there with them. And it's like pouring the rain out. Like you visually, like, it even like explains it in the book. Like
there was a massive flood.
Yeah. And like even between the book and the movie, how they do it, there's rain up to his up past his ankles.
Aside from murderous clowns, he could trip and fall, hit his head, and drown.
He was so tiny, he could have probably went down the drain without Pennywise.
That one guy got his dick eaten off by some fish.
Well, that's why you don't go dick fishing.
Okay, so Daniel.
I'm still on dick fishing.
Alright, we'll give you a minute. So,
That's one
is
way
this
to
your
get
beer or my beer?
That's yours.
Okay.
We gotta use a worm,
good.
right?
I'm good.
Okay, so a big thing for me in terms of why Stephen King books freak me out is little children dying. You've got Gage from Pet Sematary.
That's probably the worst one for me.
You've got Tad from Cujo. And now you've got, among others, Georgie from It. What do you think about Georgie? And also, how do you think this death of a child compares to some of the other iconic ones in Stephen King's books?
You know as well as I do that I've been unable to finish Cujo because of the way they write the kid.
It's rough. It's very bleak.
Georgie isn't as bad as Gage for me. It's written a lot more almost playfully, and then the death happens kind of super quick and sudden.
It just happens. Like, it's just...
So, I actually wrote down a quote.
Like, compared to the very long drawn out being trapped in the car, compared to the very realistic, I turned away from my kid for like 30 seconds and he got hit by a Mack truck.
So, two thoughts. One, if we're talking about children dying and I had to rank them,
That should be the ranking.
I probably put Georgie at number 2. I think the one that freaks me out the most is Gage. And
Gage is the worst
because he gets hit by a car, and that's
Yeah.
something I'm constantly afraid of for my
chance of you getting kidnapped by a clown or getting hit by a car are very different.
and the fact that he literally goes out to play by himself for that long.
Mm-hmm.
As like a 5-year-old kid.
As a little
like,
5-year-old kid, I'm sitting there like, the mom's sitting there playing piano. Like, I don't blame Bill. He has the flu.
Okay.
He's sitting in there dying.
Digression. Are we already inclined to dislike the mom because the first thing we learn about her is she hates rock and roll?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Oh, and then
She's a snob.
the second thing I wanted to bring up, this is a line that struck me a lot on this reread. So his boat goes into the drain. He bends down to find it. There's a clown down there.
Mhm.
They start talking. They introduce you. Oh, we're not strangers anymore. I'm Pennywise, the dancing clown. Do you smell that? Do you smell the peanuts? You smell the popcorn?
Yeah.
And then Pennywise changes. And this is the line that King writes. What he saw destroyed his sanity in one clawing stroke.
That's actually what I wanted to talk about, is everything that you need to know about it, whether you know it or not, like no spoilers, is really conveyed to you right there in that scene. You got the shifting from how could he have ever thought his eyes were yellow? They're the brightest blue, and I can smell the popcorn and the cotton candy, but there's still that smell of awful rotten leaves and dead animals down from the sewage. And how does he know the kid's name? Everything you need to know about the creature is actually in this first scene.
He also introduces himself as Pennywise the Dancing Clown, or Robert Gray.
Yeah.
Which also alludes to his history.
Yeah. So everything that you need to know is actually in this first scene, whether you know it or not. And that's on the reread for me, was what I thought was actually kind of a lot smarter than what I remembered.
Mm-hmm. As somebody who's rereading a second time, there's going to be a lot of that.
Yeah.
You're going to realize a lot of things that you didn't get the first time. You're going to be like, I can't believe this is in here so early in the book.
Yeah. So, like on my first read, some of the stuff kind of seemed a little bit random from time to time. But on this read, I'm like, oh, this was actually pretty well thought out and structured together.
I think that's something that happens with books a lot, though. Like, usually on a second or a third read, once you know the story, you start picking up on those, like, subtle hints that the author's putting there. Because they want to, like, they want to put that in your head. They're like, oh, and then they want to... I think the first time they just want to make you think, oh, like, what happened?
Mm-hmm.
And then, you keep reading, and you just pick up on that stuff more. And that happens with a lot of things. But I think... King does really well in this book.
Even down to the Lovecraftian breaking of the mind.
Yeah, it really, and it kind of just gets you that, feel of like, oh well, this is what he can do, you know, and it sets up how horrible it's going to be as it
for literally everyone else. Yeah,
I do want to acknowledge that Bill Denbrough, our protagonist in quotation marks,
who is set up to be like the mainish character.
The main-ish character. Because really, all of the losers are the main character.
I would say the main character is the loser, like, just as a whole.
In a Stephen King book, whichever character is also a writer is your main character.
Because that's Stephen King.
But he's technically first introduced in Chapter 1, but Chapter 1 is really more about Georgie and Pennywise. So we're going to talk about Bill in Chapter 3, 6 Phone Calls, when we get to him. Do we have any last thoughts on Chapter 1 and Georgie and Pennywise as we've met them so far before we move on to Adrian Mellon?
I think Pennywise's introduction might be one of the strongest, like, horror icon introductions in literature.
I mean, you and I watched on YouTube, like, a week ago, a compilation of, like, parodies of that scene. Like, how many times has that come up?
It's just iconic.
Like,
I mean, everything about Pennywise is iconic.
The only thing that I think might give it... I mean, there's probably a few things that I'm not thinking of right now, but the only thing off the top of my head, in terms of horror literature icon introductions that might come close is probably Dracula. That's
Yeah, I
saying
was going to say
something.
Dracula is the only thing that's coming to mind. Granted, I'm biased, and I'm also 3 beers into a 6-pack.
I am also biased.
See the Willem Dafoe Nosferatu.
Oh, I can't wait.
Shown today?
Yeah.
That's
so
going to
sick.
be great.
My thoughts on this with Georgie is I think that his parents should have raised him a little better not to talk to strangers.
He
Yeah,
did
like-
say that.
It's just like,
You can't just let them introduce themselves. You gotta get a little bit more.
He's 5.
yeah, but if
Well, also don't let him have
even
it
if
the rain
I
by
was
himself.
5, I think my brain would have went, how's he standing down there? Also, I'm not gonna walk up to a clown. My boat is gone. I'm not walking up to some clown dude in
No,
a
you-
drain where he should be drowning because
No,
there's
the
like
whole
3
cir-
feet of water.
The whole circus was blown down there by the storm.
Those peanuts would have been wet. Those would have been some soggy peanuts.
Right now I'm thinking of wet circus peanuts. That sounds so gross.
Oh, like the candy?
I
Yeah.
Those are gross anyway.
I like circus peanuts.
I think they're so disgusting.
So, one more thought. You have to think about the historical context. This is the 50s. This is kind of before the whole stranger danger thing
I
came
guess
about.
it is, like, for the time, he could go out by himself and nobody's gonna, kidnap him. And I guess if his parents are thinking in the fact that, like, oh, he's just going down, he's just on, so when I was growing up, my rule was stay on the street. If I went past the street, I got in trouble. So maybe that was a thing for them, stay on the street. But, I mean...
It is us projecting some modern sensibilities, but it's also like giant flood plus kid by himself.
I think the flood, even thinking if I'm a 1950s mother, I wouldn't be letting my kid go
He
out.
was so tiny, he could have just tripped and drowned in, like,
yeah, he
2
could have
foot of
washed
water.
away. And
His
also,
boat's not going to carry him.
that guy got his dick eaten off by fish.
Dick fishing.
All right, let's move on.
Dick Fish is gonna be our new band name.
Oh, Jesus.
So, chapter 2 is after the festival. We meet, not so much of a spoiler to say, mostly inconsequential character. Point of this chapter is mostly to kind of introduce us to Derry itself. I feel like we meet Adrian Mellon and his boyfriend. They're at the Derry Days Festival. They run into some bullies, some particular homophobic bullies, because Adrian and his boyfriend, spoiler, are gay. Adrian is wearing this big paper floppy top hat that says I Heart Dairy. The bullies find him and they're like, you're hurting our civic pride. You can't be wearing that, you FAG word, blah, 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 blah.
You can only say the full word if you have been with a man.
Does our game count?
Yes.
Well, then I can say it, but I'm still not going to say it.
Let's not.
Yeah, I'm still not going to. So anyways, there's an interaction. They beat up Adrian Mellon. They decide to throw him into the canal. Pennywise pulls him out of the canal, takes a big chunk out of his armpit with his teeth. Thousands of red balloons come floating out from underneath the kissing bridge that say I Heart Dairy. There's a lot of discussion about the interrogations, because the police get these guys, they're interrogating them. Both Adrian's boyfriend and one of the 3 bullies admit to seeing a clown in these balloons. There's talk about the trial and how they're all convicted but eventually acquitted and go free. This chapter isn't so much about the characters, because the only reoccurring character in here is Pennywise himself. But Daniel, what are your general thoughts about this chapter and how it builds what essentially is a character, which is Derry Main?
It's really weird to go back and see sensibilities towards homosexuals in even literature at the time. Stephen King even writes these cops as, like, yeah,
We don't like gays.
we don't like gays,
but they weren't doing anything wrong.
But they weren't doing anything wrong, so we have to convict these kids.
Which he probably was writing as if was good. He's like, I'm writing cops who don't like gays, but they're also not anti-gay, so that's cool.
And that's kind of weird to see. Again, that's just me projecting modern sensibilities onto the literature. It's always hard to read a hate crime for me.
Yeah, I think for most people it feels really bad to read that kind of stuff.
It's very real.
I do have a very pervasive fear that one day someone will hear me say a dick's not a deal breaker, and I'm going to get hate crimed over it. So every once in a while.
Maybe it'll be one of our listeners.
Do you think one of our listeners will hate crime?
Could happen.
And he writes it in such a realistic way that it's uncomfortable. Because it goes from kids verbally harassing to kids getting scolded by police that just makes them angrier, to them stalking the kids, to them beating them up, to them going, oh, beating them up's not enough. Hey, we're on a bridge. Let's toss them over the bridge because we're right here.
I mean, they just straight up just kill a kid. I mean,
it's so realistic
once again,
in the way it's written.
Killing kids, like, it's just...
Nobody tells me to suck the root.
And it's weird because it's like set up in the. It starts out like you set up in because there's like a carnival, like I don't know, carnival is the word for it.
Yeah, I think it's
fair.
carnival.
It's
fair.
It's the Dairy Days Festival.
The festival. It's like, and you know, from the books, I mean, it's set up as like it starts out as like, oh, it's happy day, and then you get that scene where you know the two boys are walking down, and then it just really sets a weird tone of like it really takes you to the time that it is because I mean you gotta think now we're in like the. You know, it's 2022, and this book, it's what, like 1980 something?
It's like 84, 85. Actually, I think
Which
I can
even
pull
at the
up a
time, it's like
timeline.
really weird for there to be like, I don't know, I guess it's hard to think like where we are now with like people like you.
I don't know, people were so super homophobic when I was in high school.
I know,
so.
but it's just so weird being being someone who's like, I don't care people.
Yeah.
I don't care. It's like love who you want to love, and then reading that scene, it's just like. It makes you feel so like uncomfortable.
It's one thing to I know people who are not I don't even like saying it this way, but the way other people would put it to me living here in rural-ish West Virginia, I'm anti-gay, but I'm tolerant.
It's just like I put up with it.
Yeah, exactly. Which
that's
not
It's
good.
It's not.
But tolerance is the least we should expect.
It's better than them just being
murdering
around, like hating like people for.
And then the way it escalates to just Pennywise being under there and feeding on the situation itself.
The one thing I do like about this whole scene is the balloon part where the balloons float up, and it just, I don't know, it sets like the environment really well.
They all say I love dairy
and even,
on it.
In the newest movie, that scene is
That
very pretty.
I said I was critical of that movie earlier, and I am, but that scene is amazing.
That scene
is so good.
That scene is the reason I hate the rest of that movie so much.
Because they blew off.
They blew the
I feel bad
entire
for the
good wall.
You think they're just some dude out there, real chapped lips, like. Oh
no, those are all CGI these days.
What if they're real?
So, just so we can keep our continuity up, George Denbrough is murdered in October of 1957. Adrian Mellon is murdered in July of 1984 at the Canal Days Festival, not the Dairy Days.
Canal Days, okay.
But
yeah, it's so... Stephen King's really good at writing realistic scenes. Sometimes that's very uncomfortable.
And I don't know...
We talked about that a lot with The Stand, with like racial prejudices.
Or The Zoo.
Yeah, or The Zoo.
Oh.
At some points it's like, it's so weird that he writes that stuff so well, it makes you think that, like, has he experienced some of this stuff in his life? Has he, known people? Because I feel like a lot of authors, some of the stuff they write is stuff that they've experienced. It's stuff that they... Because I feel like it's really hard to write something that
you've never
been through. And if you do write it, it feels really empty. Mm-hmm. Like there's nothing to it. And that, I don't know, that scene, every time I've read it or listened to it, it just hits different.
So I want to talk about it from a aspect of character. So the character that's being built in this scene, or this chapter, is really Derry itself. As you read this book, you'll find that Derry is an evil place. One of the first things that Mike Hanlon says in the first interlude is it possible for an entire town to be haunted? You'll find that things happen in Derry that don't happen in other places. More people are murdered, more people disappear, there's a higher rate of crime. But the spookiest part about it is that people don't talk about it. People don't help each other. Something that happens in this chapter is as Adrian is being beaten up by these guys, a car drives by and
People just ignore
they
it.
just drive right by. And that happens in real life, yes. But you also see stories on the news of random people who jump into situations and help people. That happens too, but not in Derry.
Not in Derry. Never in Derry.
That does not happen.
Unless you're in the Losers Club.
So it's almost like the town is just very sedated. I don't know, just like just live day to day and not be bothered to do anything for anyone else at most points. I don't know.
So we're gonna come back to this when we get to scary shit because there's more to talk about. But we really need to get into probably what is going to be the largest part of our discussion of this episode, which is Chapter 3, 6 phone calls, and this is where we are introduced to our first 6 losers. And it's going to be difficult to talk about each of them just in the context of this chapter, but I think we can do it. The first one we meet is Stan the Man Urus. And in each of these segments, we learn a little bit about the losers and how their lives have progressed since they have left the town of Derry, and how they've all found success in their lives, and where we find them in their lives as it has returned, and Mike, the 7th loser, is calling them to let them know and tell them that they've made this promise and their memories start to reactivate. So, Daniel, I'm going to kick it to you. I would like you to tell me about Stan through his wife, Patty Urus, which is the perspective that we get in this chapter.
Yep. This was the hardest chapter for me to get through.
Yes, it's deep and dark.
It is not only because it's dark, but the way it's written. I was literally, because I was listening to it on audiobook this time around, driving home, and I had to stop it because I was cringing so bad it was causing me to swerve. It's very interesting because when you're getting stuff from Patty's perspective, you're getting like these like little tidbits of, and she would tell people later that she thought this, but really all she was thinking was, oh, what's going to happen on this TV show? Or she dismisses these thoughts like it's almost a non-issue.
So Stan and Patty are watching television. They're watching The Price is Right or
some game show.
Yeah.
Mike calls, interrupts their night. He talks to Stan for a little bit. Stan hangs up the phone, goes up to says he's going to take a bath, which is unusual for this time of night.
Mm-hmm.
Slits his wrist and kills himself in the bath. And what you are talking about is that as Patty is talking to her family and the cops and stuff later, is she's lying to people and saying that she knew something was wrong from the beginning, but the truth is that she didn't.
Yeah. It was just almost completely fogged over. And she has these little memories of like when he says the turtle couldn't help us.
Yes.
These little idiosyncrasies. Even when you get into her trying to get pregnant, and it's not working, you're getting all these clues to what the lives of these adults are really like just through Stan's. It's hard for me to talk about Stan without thinking about how the adaptations have all handled his chapters.
Stan is a very important character because
I'd almost forgotten that he was the first loser we got because
he's the first one that you're really introduced to, and ultimately he's the one you know the least about.
Yeah.
And because he kills himself, he's the one who doesn't go back to Derry. He's the one who doesn't face it. And spoiler alert, that is explained, but we're not going to talk about it now.
But it also aids in that building up the mystery that wants you to keep reading.
Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, is this book, the primary focus of it is about them as kids. And in this first part, you don't meet any of them for kids, save Bill for a hot minute. What part 1 really does is build that mystery. You meet Pennywise in chapter 1 and 2 where he kills Georgie and Adrian.
Mm-hmm.
But aside from that, you don't really know anything about it. You know bad stuff happened. You know there were 7 friends. You know they made a promise to come back if Pennywise ever returned.
Yep.
And you know Stan Urus could not face that and he killed himself. And that's really all you know.
Yeah.
I know the scene always gets me a little bit because it's I guess our first actual scene of just like suicide, you know, and it's weird because he's, you know, pretty happy. I mean,
Yeah.
in terms of like Stan's character, I mean, he's living the life right now. He's, you know, happy wife, everything's going well, and then he gets that phone call and it all just kind of hits him.
They are financially successful, as all the losers aside from Mike are. They have a big house. He runs his own accounting business. They're essentially rich, but
Like everything at that point is like perfect until that phone call.
Aside from that they don't have children, which is a big part of that chapter. But
and then doesn't he? If I remember, doesn't he slit his wrist in like a T or?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's described so vividly that I wanted to throw up driving.
He writes it on the wall in blood, doesn't he?
He writes, and the way King describes it is he slits both of his wrists in a T, and then he writes it on the wall, and then you can see where the bottom of the T, his arm slides down with the blood as he's dying, and then he falls over backwards outside of the tub. So when Patty walks in, it says, and I don't remember the exact words.
If he could see, she would have been upside down.
Exactly, is what it.
But he couldn't see because he's super dead.
Because he's super dead.
I guess at that point you get even just, it's just King like laying on like, this is, you know, it's horror for these people. Like when they start to remember it,
this is how far removed he wants to be from the situation.
He did not want anything to do with it. Which, I mean, I guess as you get to understand his character as we like progress throughout the story, you'll understand like why he just, you know, there's like that.
There's also, and some people say this as a criticism of the book, but there is actually a singular specific reason why he wouldn't go back and face it that I forgot about on my reread last year, and it really hit me when I was rereading it last year. And then because it struck me so much, I went and sought out some other reviews and stuff, and that was something that some people were critical about the book, but that comes up in part 5. We'll discuss it when we get there.
It's pretty far down the line.
So let's move on. We're gonna come back to the suicide when we get to scary shit. Our next character is Richie Tozier, which he is often identified as a lot of people's favorite of all the losers. And as we meet Richie, he is a very successful DJ in Hollywood. He does voices on the radio. Daniel, tell me a little bit about this chapter and your thoughts on Richie.
I honestly thought this chapter was a little bit funny, because in my head I just pictured myself calling my boss and going, "Yeah, I need to drop everything to go to a town. I don't really have
powder."
Yeah, I don't really have an excuse. I know you got like a guy who's super excited to meet me coming in, but just give him a substitute. It's fine.
Doesn't it open with him puking in the toilet?
Yeah. And he's and any time his boss tries it, he just does one of his funny voices. He's like, "Oh no, I'll just make a joke," because that's what Richie does. Is he makes a joke out of everything. So that's his coping mechanism.
He deflects with humor.
Yeah, I wouldn't know anything about that.
He does it with the bullies. He does it with his boss. Matt, what do you think about Richie in general as a character?
Richie's definitely the character I would probably relate to the most, as just probably now and as when I was, you know, a kid. But I think, you know, the whole using, you know, funny voices and just to reflect and just to deal with, you know, trauma and all that stuff too. Because I guess one of the big things you point out here is he's not wearing glasses in this. Mm-hmm. He's started wearing contacts. Mm-hmm.
They slide out of his face as he's like he's splashing water on his face, and the contacts slide out almost in like a supernatural sense.
So as we go into book 2, you'll see that each of these losers has a particular characteristic that they're bullied for as a kid. Richie's is glasses. Well, it's one of them. And it's symbolic that when he leaves Derry and starts to grow up and become successful, he loses the glasses and starts wearing contacts. But then when his past catches up with him, Mike calls him and lets him know that it is back, his contacts fall out, and he has to go back to glasses.
Yeah.
And it's also like, he's also, as far as I can remember, not married, not in a relationship at the time either.
Nope. He's
just
always looking for the next Mrs. Tozier.
Floating
next
around.
Mrs. Tozier. Yes,
Richie's my favorite character. I mean, I was just it's gonna be that guy.
Go ahead and move next to Ben Hanscom Haystack. He is a extremely successful architect. You get a lot of background about all the various projects he's done. The one they keep going back to is the BBC headquarters in London and how it's a very controversial design. When we meet him in this chapter, we actually get him from the perspective of his bartender, Ricky Lee. Ricky Lee runs a kind of hole-in-the-wall bar in Nebraska where Ben lives, and Ben always comes to have a drink on Friday and Saturday night. Even if he's in London or somewhere else in the world working on one of his projects, he has a private jet. He leaves whatever he's doing Friday afternoon, comes home to Nebraska, has drinks at Ricky Lee's bar on Friday and Saturday, and then leaves again on Sunday to go back to work. Now, Daniel, what I want you to do,
Okay.
when we meet Ben, he's already talked to Mike, and he's come to the bar to cope.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to explain to us what he does to cope with his conversation with Mike.
He gets the strongest bottle of liquor that he can find and just drinks the whole thing.
So he gets a
It's a big bottle.
a
too.
pint. Well, he
Yeah.
gets like a pint mug,
Yeah.
and he has Ricky Lee fill it with wild turkey.
Yeah.
And he gets slices of lemon. He leans his head back and he squirts lemon juice into his nostrils.
Was it one of the Native Americans, indigenous people tricks that he had
He
learned?
said he learned it from indigenous people in Peru.
Okay.
And that he chugs the wild turkey. Which, I don't know about you, but
Just someone who's drank wild turkey, I would never chug wild turkey.
What?
would you
No.
would you squirt lemon juice into your nose and then do it?
Let's try it.
No.
As long as it's not that whiskey that I drank last time I was here.
That was gross.
That stuff was not great.
I don't remember what it was, but I remember the label, so I won't buy it
This is
again.
also in the book. We get like a little bit of I don't know. I guess you wouldn't call it an Easter egg because it's in the same book. But the coins,
Yeah.
because
Mhm.
he puts the two he gives the
The
two
silver dollars,
coins-
he gives them to
coins,
Ricky Lee for his
which is
kids.
something that will come up.
That will
later.
come up later, yeah.
I think out of all the this one's like, I don't know. He gets drunk. I mean, he doesn't want to go back, but he gets drunk and he says he's pretty much just
keeps
like
going, yeah.
just like fuck it, gotta go.
I
mean-
liked when he removed his shirt and showed the scar.
So, something that's different about this chapter is the perspective in each of them changes. Stan's chapter is from his wife's perspective. Richie's chapter, because he is single, is from his perspective. Ben is also single, no wife, no kids, but he has a very strong relationship with his bartender, so this one is from his bartender's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So let's keep moving so we can get through some of this. Their fourth one is Eddie Kasprak, and this one is a little different.
She had the ability to be huge.
Okay, so we meet Eddie, and this section is full of what you might call a Stephen King trope, which is, I want to say, like, fatphobia. Describing fat people as basically monsters.
Stephen King does not like fat people. I don't know any other way to put it. I'm sorry if that offends you, but every book I've read where there is a fat person, they are either a villain or described super negatively.
You shouldn't be offended that we're pointing it out.
Yeah.
You can definitely be offended by King and how he describes fat people.
The only real exception to this that I can think of out of every book I've read is Ben himself.
Yeah,
because
But even then, they go out of his way to go, hey, this kid has tits, isn't that funny?
I'm pretty sure there's a section in part 2 where he describes Ben's ass as roughly the size of Arizona.
Yeah.
he's very detailed and
Yeah, and now he's like...
the bullying of some of the stuff.
The fourth layer of cellulite
Yeah, it's-
reflected off of the glistening sun.
So who gets described here is Eddie's wife, Myra, and his mother. The conceit of this chapter is Eddie has already talked to Mike. He's in a panic. He's packing to go back to Derry. He's a hypochondriac. He's constantly worried about getting sick. He's addicted to taking medications. His medicine cabinet looks like a CVS shelf. And the other thing is that he was dominated by his mother as a child. She kept him out of gym class because she believed he has asthma. Spoiler alert, he doesn't have asthma.
It's all fake.
Yeah, it was all fake. She, kept him from going out and playing. She kept him from doing this. She kept him from doing that. And Eddie, as an adult, even though his mother is dead, he still hears her voice in his head as he tries to accomplish things as an adult. And to make it even worse, he is committing psychological incest by marrying a woman who is basically his mother.
I mean, we've all been there, right?
No.
No? Really? Wow. Just Daniel?
Just Daniel.
Yeah, no, I've never been married, so...
I'll give it time, buddy.
Oh, God. No, but I think,
just don't call your mom's name.
What sucks about this, I think Eddie goes through, a lot of trauma, not just it, but with his mom. And that's, a lot of growth with this character, though, because there are points when he does, kind of push against that.
Yeah, there's, I think it's part 4, there's a very memorable scene where he stands up to his mother, which we'll get to, obviously, but...
Yeah.
But it really does suck that, he grows up, and he gets through all that stuff, he grows up, and he's just, he's a limousine driver, right?
He owns a limousine company.
And he just marries a woman who just treats him like how his mom treats him, and doesn't...
But Eddie!
She's very manipulative in this chapter, pulling out every stop to try to get him to not go.
It's just weird, though, because, when you... I guess he has the limousine company, but I wouldn't say his life in general is,
He's
a trophy chaser. He loves it.
Fantastic.
He is financially successful. He is not happy.
Yeah, which...
Yeah.
I guess that's because they all have their drawbacks, right?
They're all financial and professional successes.
But they all have that there's one drawback that's just
Stan and Patty
can't have kids,
and they want kids.
Yeah.
Richie is alone. Ben is alone. Eddie is tormented by his mother's upbringing, and he's
still haunted by how his wife treats him and stuff and such.
And then actually, Bill's kind of an exception to this, but we'll get to Bill soon. So let's go ahead and keep moving.
Oh, no.
Next one is Beverly
You
Marsh.
get to start this one, Matt. Tell us about Beverly.
I have a hard time reading this section every time.
It's hard.
Because it's just, it's just domestic abuse. Violence. Specifically the details, wanted you, because it's been a while since I've read it. But I know in the back, I have in the back of my head how the last time I read it, how...
So this one, and actually Bill's, is actually from a third-person omniscient narrator. King likes to jump around with the perspective. Basically, we actually find out more about her husband, Tom Rogan. But Beverly, she moved to Chicago. She became a fashionista, essentially. She has her own line of clothes.
Since she got hired, she didn't get hired by her husband, right?
No,
he kind of leached off of her.
Okay,
well,
I couldn't remember.
He actually kind of pushed her to success, because when they met, she was working for a fashion design company, but he recognized her talent, and it describes that he, throughout his life, has been looking for somebody like this that he could latch on to, push her to success, and then he would leech off of her.
He's just a lazy piece of shit.
He's a total piece of shit.
He is I think out of the whole book, this is one of the hardest parts of the book for me to get through. And I think it's just the detail of how it's written.
What basically happens is you get a description of how their relationship progresses, how Tom, almost in a Palpatine-esque way, manipulates her over years and dominates her. And he uses small things that you wouldn't think of, like not smoking. How he forbids her to smoke and uses that as a tool to dominate her emotionally and physically.
It's a lot of,
you can have a cigarette now.
A lot of gaslighting and, physical, sexual abuse. Just
that sex scene, though.
So we'll get to that in Kiss Me, Fat Boy. it all comes to a head where one night Mike calls Bev. She's immediately on board. Yes, we promised. I don't remember exactly all of this, but I know I have to go back to Derry. I'll be there. As she's packing to go, she subconsciously lights up a cigarette. Tom comes into the room, sees she's smoking. Whenever he catches her smoking, he makes it a point to beat her, to remind her that he's the boss. We get a very visceral description of him attempting to abuse her. We also get flashbacks of him actually abusing her. This situation is different because she's kind of been reawakened by her conversation with Mike, and she actually stands up to him and fights back the belt. Like, this guy is the lowest piece of shit, but I still felt it when she whips him in the nuts with that belt.
That's pretty funny.
Oh my god.
The way he described the belt and him putting it on, too, was really unsettling.
It's hard. And if you're triggered by domestic abuse or by an abusive couple where one person is dominated by the other, it can be a very difficult chapter to get through.
Rough section to get through.
Mm-hmm. And there's going to be a lot of things like that in this book, and some things that are worse if you have different triggers, sexual assault, child abuse, death of children, and so on and so forth. But it basically ends with her fighting him off and her leaving to go to the airport to go back to Derry. Now, Daniel, I know you've been wanting to talk about Bill's chapter. Or Bill's section.
I love Bill's chapter. Bill's chapter is pretty much just everything I've ever wanted to say to a goddamn college professor in my entire freaking life.
So we meet Bill, and he's a professional. He's Stephen King.
Yeah, he's just Stephen King.
He's a successful horror writer whose books are adapted into movies, and he's involved in some level. Where he's not Stephen King is he's married like an A-list Hollywood actress.
That's just what he wanted.
Sorry, Tabitha.
I don't know what to tell her.
And they're actually, when they get the call from Mike, they're in England on location filming an adaptation for one of his books. Mm-hmm. But probably the best part of this chapter is the build-up from Bill being a college student who's just kind of starting to get into writing short stories, his interaction with his writing class and his writing professor, and becoming a professional writer by selling a short story to a smut magazine, and then that leading to his first novel, which leads him to go to Hollywood and so on and so forth. But if you want to share some of your thoughts about
I'm looking up that quote that I love.
It was that if politics and fiction ever become interchangeable, I'll kill myself.
I love it. It's perfect. It's I don't know what people's individual experiences with college has been. Pretty much for all of my electives, I either took a literature class or I took a philosophy class. And let me tell you, every single one of them was filled with this exact professor who has some minor publications, who has to find deep meaning in every single little scene. And to the point where, like, Bill writes a science fiction story, and he's like, oh yes, the phallic imagery of the spaceship really showed the psychosexual implications of a capitalist pig society. And that's just not what the story's about.
Bill's like, no, it's just a story about a spaceship.
And Bill just wants to write a story and let things naturally evolve from them. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with either approach, but there is a type that goes, no, everything has to have meaning or it's pointless, instead of letting meaning be pulled from things.
Well, that is technically true. If there is no point, then it is in fact pointless.
Yeah. You know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
That's almost as good as Big Fish. But just like his entire confrontation where, like, the college professor goes, did Shakespeare just write stories for pennies? Or, I forget who the other author was he brought up. Was it The Catcher in the Rye Dude?
No, it's Faulkner.
Faulkner. Like, Or did he just want to write about the... And Bill's like, yeah, probably. And if you look back historically, yeah, Shakespeare almost wrote exclusively for money because he needed to live.
Mm-hmm.
And then people over centuries have found all this new meaning, and they're projecting modern sensibilities onto his works. Oh, he was ahead of his... And maybe he was, but I don't think that's what he had in mind when he was trying to write these plays in this time frame.
People gotta eat.
Yeah, people gotta eat. And Bill sees that, and the professor's like, oh, you just got so much to learn. And Bill's like, alright. And he goes and does his own thing, and it's beautiful.
I would love to see Tolkien in that class. Because Tolkien hated allegory.
Tolkien hated allegory. He's applicability. You write a situation that could apply to any situation, and it will work forever.
Tolkien just wanted to write good-ass books.
Yeah.
He's like, I got a story and I want to write it.
So people ask him, so what is the Lord of the Rings about? It's an allegory for World War II, right? No, it's actually about an evil ring that needs to be destroyed.
So it's about these little people.
What are you talking about?
They eat a lot of bread and drink a lot of beer.
There's a dwarf.
I sympathize.
So a Friday night. You also get, a peek of what Bill got made fun of in this too, where he's worried about his stutter.
Yeah.
Coming back as like
when his stutter starts to come back after he gets his phone call.
And also his scars come back.
Yeah.
Yeah. The ones on his palms, and even his wife's like, those weren't there yesterday.
Well, the scar comes back for all of them, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's first mentioned with Bill.
So, and here's a good time for me to bring this up. This is something I noticed on this read through. The order in which you meet the losers, I don't know if this is intentional or if this is me overreading a situation on this book.
You're being a college professor right now.
No, because I'm not. You kind of are introduced to them in an order that reflects how honest they are about the situation. So let's go backwards. Bill tells Audra, his wife, everything he can remember.
Yep.
And he tells her, I would tell you more, but I can't remember it. Let's go back one. Beverly tries to explain to Tom what's going on. He prevents her from doing so. Go back one more. Eddie tells his wife Myra a little bit about what's going on, but not as much as he could. Granted, a cab was waiting on him.
Yeah.
And then Ben and Richie are alone, so they essentially don't have anybody to tell anything. And then the first one we meet is the person who could not... He couldn't say anything to his wife, lied to his wife about who was on the phone, and could not be honest about it, even with himself, that he took his own life.
Yep.
So you start with the person who is the least honest about it and can't face it, and then we end with the person who is the most honest about the situation with his spouse.
I don't know if you're reading too much into that, but that is super neat. I think that's I didn't even pick up on that, so that's kind of cool.
And that could be just because that's how the characters are in general.
Yeah.
Or that could just be how it's meant to be. I don't...
Well, I mean, it's true. When we get more into part 2 and you're learning about them as kids, the two that deny what's going on the longest are Richie and Stan.
Yeah.
They are the last ones to kind of come to terms with what's going on. And Bill, obviously, because of Georgie, is never really doubting what's going on. And then as you kind of work down this reverse list, like I said, Beverly and Eddie, they just do whatever Bill says. They're always with Bill. But all right, we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Well, I guess we missed something with Bev, too, because it kind of relates to her situation as a kid as well. The relationship with her spouse,
and her dad.
It's just like how with Eddie and his wife, goes back to his mom.
It even mentions it in that chapter that I think she thinks about her father briefly, but then she also thinks about a guy she dated in college that broke her nose.
So wrapping up our character section, our last chapter of book 1 is the first interlude, where we meet Mike Hanlon, the 7th loser. These interludes are his notes from an unpublished history of Derry. This first one is primarily about him deciding that he wants to start or keeping these notes in this journal about how he got started with his research, how he spoke with the former head librarian. Mike still lives in Derry. He'd never left. He works as a librarian in the public library. He is not a financial success. Blah, 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 blah. He starts writing this history. He starts learning about the victims. And we also, in these sections, will learn about the history of Derry, past interactions that it, or Pennywise, has had with the town. And in the first interlude, we learn about the settlement of the area by European settlers. They were called the Derry Company. They set up this logging camp, and everybody disappeared in a very Roanoke Island-esque situation. Daniel, I know you and I were talking the other day about how you really enjoy these interludes. Do you want to...
We've brought this up, I think, several times at this point. Anytime there's like a journal entry or something's written from like a newspaper perspective, I love that kind of stuff. I think it's really good for world building.
Very Dracula-esque writing structure.
Yeah, that stuff's like porn to me. Like,
yes. It's like good porn.
Oh yeah, give me the newspaper.
Even when I'm playing a video game, like when I'm playing like Silent Hill or Resident Evil, my favorite thing to do is like find the little notebooks and read the notebooks of like the notes that people left
That's
behind.
why I fucking took me so long to stop playing Skyrim, because I kept reading all that shit I would
Like you
find.
pick it up and you're like, oh.
Listen, man, I can only I can read the lusty Argonian maid over and over.
That was my phone background for a while. It's lusty Argonian maid. But it makes the world feel more real. At least from like a certain perspective for me, you know, like here's a dude taking the time to write this history and interview these people, and it's like playing detective, you know what I mean? I really love, especially when he's talking to the one guy whose daughter died, talking about the voices in the pipes.
Betty Ripscomb.
Thank you. That was freaking great. And even the old librarian's like, dude, you really should just stop. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, you're not going to learn anything great from any of this. So it almost gives you the sense that somebody's maybe tried to do this before.
Scary shit. Scary shit. It is time to talk about scary shit. What shit was scary? What shit was not? It is time to talk about scary shit.
So let's actually use that as a transition into our next section, scary shit.
Yeah.
Where we talk about what shit was scary and what shit was not. And spoiler alert, there's not a whole lot that's not scary in this. We were going to break these down one at a time, but we've talked a lot about this before. So instead, let's just go around the circle one at a time and tell me what in this first part of it scared you the most and why. Matt, why don't you kick us off?
The first time we meet Pennywise in this section, when he just like eats the dude's armpit.
Yeah, well, that's...
Are you talking about like all this section, right?
Yeah, all of part one.
And it was like particularly just like a scary scene. I mean, that's just
Drags him under the bridge.
Drags him under the bridge, rips his armpit off.
Makes eye contact with his boyfriend while he's doing it. It's like, hey man, watch what I'm going to do.
What freaked me out about that is the cops, during the autopsy, they see that he has bites out of him, and they thought that the bullies were biting him as they beat him.
Bit it. I mean, it's just a weird, like, you know, they're just inclined to just believe anything that's not.
I think one of the cops makes a comment that they probably had like a fucking huge heart on while they were doing it.
I hope they get cornholed when they go to Shawshank.
And when they go to Shawshank, we're gonna send them a card and saying, I hope that your boyfriend's nice. I don't remember exactly what they said.
It says, I hope the guy who raped you had AIDS.
Yes, that's what it was. Oh, and we didn't even talk about that when we were talking about Adrian Mellon. This is in the 80s in terms of the AIDS pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
That was a huge thing. Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. Daniel, what scared you most about part one?
I'm going to have to say the suicide, because I almost crashed my car listening to it. Everything else I had an easy time listening to.
What about the first time you read the book?
Probably also something about very viscerally described blood drops. Like, seeing blood doesn't really freak me out, but like when I'm picturing like the tendons in the arms and the body just slowly bleeding out. and he's locked on the other side of the door, and his wife was literally right downstairs. Something about that entire situation petrifies me.
Like, that just doesn't, like, I don't know. It's not a nice thing, but, like, for me, that's just not scary to me. It's just because
I lived with a suicidal guy for a pretty long time, and every time I came home, the first thing I did was look in the showers to see if he hung himself. So it started to get to me after a while.
there are other parts in this book that are scary to me, but I feel like in this first section, it's like, scary is not a word I would use for a lot of it. I would use more like, I don't know, mentally damaging, maybe. Because, like, there's the suicide.
Mentally damaging's not wrong.
There's
Tom and Beverly.
There's all the abuse,
The homophobia.
homophobia.
Just the hate crime in general.
It's very real.
Mhm.
It's very real fear. It's not like your typical, like, horror movie, kind of fear. It's just like, this could happen.
Yeah.
And I guess when you think of it that way, yeah, that's scary.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
But it's not scary like...
It's not scary like, boo scary. It's scary like, oh, real shit scary.
It's
like,
not being chased with a chainsaw scary.
Yeah.
I don't want to be hate crime scary.
I agree with everything you said, but I think this is very scary. But I think that's because, to me, the scariest parts of this book are the real things. Aside from just in general, the thought of losing your kids and your kids dying, that's always the scariest thing to me in any book. But because a lot of the child deaths in this book are very fantastical, I don't find them to be the scariest parts. The things that really stand up to me are coming home and finding that your spouse has killed themselves, or being jumped by random people. Those are things that I think about at night and freak me the fuck out.
Turning your head away from your kid for a small amount of time and then they're gone.
They're gone. And just a quick mention to the miniseries. The miniseries opens with the mom who is putting out the laundry, and she runs back inside to grab some more laundry, and within 30 seconds, like, Pennywise comes out of the laundry and gets her girl.
Hi. I
Yeah.
remember that
Hi.
scene. Yeah.
Oh, fuck. All right.
rewatch that. It's been so long.
Yeah, well, you'll have to join us for that episode, and we can all rewatch it together or something, if we have time.
We'll do a shot every time there's a clown.
No, we will not do that.
I don't wanna
Maybe
die.
we'll do a sip of beer every time there's a clown.
Okay, yeah, we could do that.
Okay.
I don't want us all have to have our own bottle of...
Gin.
Okay, so
Whatever.
moving on to...
Wild turkey.
Kiss me, fat boy.
Kiss me, fat boy. I wanted to talk about Bev and Tom's relationship here. And without getting too much into Bev's background, we know that there's some hints that she has not a great relationship with her father.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that she's in an abusive relationship with Tom currently, and she in the past has been with other people who have abused her. One of the hardest parts about this chapter for me was rectifying how King writes her as she is abused by Tom,
Mm-hmm.
and she doesn't fight back. Okay, if she comes from an abusive home life from her parents, I understand that. That makes sense with the character. But then what happens afterwards is they have sex, and she physically gets off to the point where she's having multiple orgasms
How many times did you come, Bev?
because of the way he physically treats her in bed. And like this is one of those situations where I wish we weren't three white guys in a basement talking about this, and I wish we had the perspective of a woman to add to this conversation. But with those caveats, what do you think about, Daniel, what do you think about Tom and Bev's relationship?
In my very brief experience in relationships, I have found that there is a lot of people who take their trauma and they sexualize it. I'm not a psychologist.
I must have almost suffocated by panties at some point as a child.
But
Damn it.
But as a guy who studied psychology in college, again, not a psychologist, not even a counselor, but just from very briefly what I read, one of the things that Freud always talked about was there's only two things that drive human nature, and that's sex and death. And sometimes those wires get crossed. And then I understand why so many women ask me to choke them out.
Okay.
The girl,
That's for a different podcast.
the girlfriend I had before this last one reminds me a lot of Bev. And she got upset that I wasn't more abusive, and that's why the relationship ended. So
all right.
I feel like there's just like a distinct difference between a little bit like some roughness and then just abuse.
It's hard to explain without getting too graphic.
It's written in a way that King hints that she is turned on by the abuse.
And sometimes and especially because when you go back and you read the book, it's a coming of age story. These are kids on the cusp of puberty, and people are like, you sit there and you think, well, how do furries happen? Well, sometimes when you're sitting there and you're watching your favorite Scooby-Doo episode, all of a sudden you hit puberty and a wire gets crossed.
I don't think I ever wanted to fuck Scooby-Doo.
But I definitely wanted to fuck Velma.
Yeah.
You got the right wire crossed.
I'm sorry.
Some people get the wrong wire crossed.
That was past tense. Want, not wanted.
Still want to.
And some people, whenever they're going through these developmental changes, they're being hit, they're being abused, and so the wire gets crossed of, you're on the cusp of sexuality, this horrible thing is happening to you, now you can't make the distinguishment between them anymore. It's not good, it's just something that happens.
It's this whole scene is so touchy.
Yeah,
because
it's
it's
super
like,
touchy, it's hard to talk about.
Because like you said, it's like three just white dudes. It's like not really something we have the right to like fully speak on, because it's not something that we'll deal with like in our you're practically married. You're a whore.
I mostly
You're a whore.
I mostly date strippers and femboys. So
yeah,
but
the last time he introduced me to a girlfriend, I saw her vagina on the same night.
Did you guys go to the strip club and meet her?
yeah, it was great.
I think that was
It
the
was
last time I hung
horrible.
out.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. Yes.
But it's, I don't know how to like say this. Was there like any thought of like, is she using it as a way to just cope? Like
that's what I'm saying.
Cope because she's like numb everywhere else, and then this is like the one time that maybe she.
I think
that's what I'm saying. That's what wire crossing does to your psyche. Is you can't cope with it any other way than the way that your brain has hardwired.
Because the way it's laid out, she went from her dad, who pretty much gaslit her and just abused her and just kind of. She was really nothing.
Accused her of being a whore
and
all
then
the time.
She grows up, but that's all she's really known. I mean, we get some like small little kind of like your teenage, not even teenage, like how they're what like.
So, they are 11.
They're like okay, so they're
for the bulk of the story when they're kids. In the movie, they're actually like aged up to 13.
But like we get that we get some of those scenes where they're kind of like romancy, but not. But then she grows up and she just has abusive relationship. So that's really all she's
That's your
I guess
normal.
from going from her dad programmed, I guess would be like she's kind of like
it hardwired.
Yeah. She's wired to be that way, and then she gets with Tom, and it's like
because when you're
that's all she knows. She's never known a guy that treats her.
It's like when you talk about
person.
Unlearning something. It's easier to teach a kid to unlearn something than it is an adult, especially once you hit upper 20s and 30s. It becomes near impossible to get out of a habit of something.
There is something that happens in part 4 that I think lends credence to what Matt was explaining. So we will revisit this topic. And if we have any listeners who are female who want a guest spot on the show, it's particularly for part 5.
Carrie wanted to do it.
Should have begged.
Yeah.
Should have begged.
No, she hates it. Carrie would be more than welcome, specifically for part 5. Okay, so just briefly hitting the power of Christ compels you.
The power of Christ compels you! The power of Christ compels you!
There's not a lot to talk about religion here, although I do want to just mention that in the first interlude where Mike is talking about what Betty Ripscomb heard from the pipes, one of the things that Pennywise says to her is, "Our name is Legion."
Mm-hmm.
And that's all we're gonna mention on religion for this.
Religion really isn't a thing in this one.
Oh my God, are you Stephen King? No, I'm Dean Koontz. Oh.
All right, so let's move on to Kings and Koontzes. And Matt, as I talked to you about in our pre-show, Kings and Koontzes is our props and our slops. What was your favorite thing about this part of the book? What was your least favorite thing? Daniel, what was your favorite and your least favorite of part 1 of Stephen King's It?
Oh God, my favorite part was probably Pennywise's introduction, because like I said, especially on a reread, you just see so much of what is being conveyed to you about the horrors that are in store. It's almost, I would say, fascinating.
Fascinating.
To read it. And to read it.
I was going to make a Spock joke, but that's fine. Fascinating.
God, it's really hard to come up with a Koontz here.
I had to cheat a little bit on mine.
Maybe Richie's chapter, because I just think it was the weakest out of all of them. And that's me having to stretch for it.
Yes, but I would say that maybe Richie gets a little bit more disproportionately to the other losers later in the book.
Yeah. That's what I'm probably going to have to go with, because I think the first part of this is probably the strongest.
So my king is actually going to be the first interlude and the world building and the just kind of like the explanations of dairy and its nature. We didn't mention this. Something I really liked in chapter 2 after the festival was Adrian and his boyfriend debating about how his boyfriend wants to leave dairy because he's from the area and he knows it's evil. Adrian's not from Derry. He just sees it as a little picturesque New England town.
He just thinks it's a nice little place.
Mm-hmm. And I just love how we're just slowly learning about the ominous nature of this town. And then my Koontz, and like I said, this is cheating a little bit. My Koontz is that we're having to talk about this without spoilers. It's so hard.
It's hard to come up with the Koontz for this.
Yeah, it's so hard. Go ahead, Matt.
I think I have to agree with Daniel on the favorite part. I just think that opening section with Pennywise's full introduction is just way too good not to be the best part.
Chef's kiss.
Because I think there are other really good parts. Like said, the balloon scene is just fantastic. I don't even know what a least favorite.
Yeah, it's not easy.
There's nothing in this section that I'd just be I don't like this, unless it comes down to just I want to sometimes just want to kick Eddie's wife in the face. It's just it just sucks that he's just more trauma on top of that.
He is kind of stuck in that cycle.
Yeah, I don't know. It just doesn't seem fair that he has to deal with that still. But I wouldn't say any of the parts are just my least favorite. That's just a nitpicky thing. That's just if I had to pick something, he could have at least got a nicer wife. That wasn't.
Beverly could have also gotten a nicer husband, but
that's also true.
But those are the two characters that are most influenced by their parents, and that's
thematically it fits.
Yeah, and that's it's explained by their spouses.
If they're going to have that drawback,
it just kind of sucks to read about.
That's the thing.
It's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's just,
and there are lots of uncomfortable things in this book.
Oh, there are a lot of moments that are just make you want to put it down and walk away for a month and then maybe come back.
So, and then let's move on. We're winding down here. So we have a new section of the show that's just going to be for it, which is called the Dairy Yellow Pages, where I'm making a list of all of the locations in Derry that are mentioned in the book as we meet them. And we're not going to discuss all these, but part of what I really love about this book is the world building and how you really get a picture of Derry itself in your head, and how not all of these places that I'm going to list, but most of them are going to play some pivotal role in the story. So these are the locations in Derry that we're introduced to just in part 1. Derry Home Hospital, Derry Elementary School, the Barrens, 9th Street Middle School, Derry High School, the Derry Public Library, the Kissing Bridge, the Standpipe, the Kitchener Iron Works, the Canal, Jackson and Witcham Street, the Black Spot, Up Mile Hill, Bassey Park, and the Falcon, which, by the way, is the coolest fucking name for a bar.
It's a pretty good name.
It's pretty. Granted, that's my Star Wars bias is showing there, but. And then also, we have just a small section here, the history of Derry. We're just going to be adding to this as we go throughout the book, adding the past events where Pennywise was involved. The first one we learn about here in part 1 is the disappearance of the original Derry company, the loggers who settled the area. Not the first people, the Micmac Indians were there originally, but the first European settlers. And I wanted to mention this, but this kind of crosses over with a book we previously read, Phantoms.
Yeah.
Mass disappearances is a theme that we've talked about before on the podcast.
Something referring to itself as Legion, talking through the pipes.
There will be a lot of mass disappearances.
We will be talking more about Phantoms on a later episode. All right, and then I just wanted to throw in some King Easter eggs, some references.
It's almost Easter.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so these are things that appear in it that also appear in other King stories, or vice versa. We mentioned Shawshank, which is where some of the bullies go after they're tried. Shawshank is, of course, the prison from The Shawshank Redemption, based on the novella Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King. We also have Richie refers to Marvin Gaye as the newest member of the All Dead Band, meaning musicians who died before their time. Stephen King actually wrote a short story in the Nightmares and Dreamscapes collection called You Know They Got a Hell of a Band, which is a story about a couple who gets lost in Oregon and finds a small town in the woods that is entirely populated by dead musicians. John Lennon, Jimi Hendrix, blah, 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 Jim Morrison, and they're all zombies. So that's a fun...
That sounds kind of rad.
Yeah, it's fun. So sometimes they come back is a phrase that's mentioned in this, in part 1, is also the name of another short story from Stephen King's Night Shift collection, which is also about zombies. It is also about bullying. It's about a guy who is a teacher at a high school, and his students start dying one at a time, and they're replaced by his bullies from when he was a kid. Moving forward, the town of Gatlin and the town of Hemmingford Home are mentioned in Ben's chapter. Gatlin is where Children of the Corn takes place, and Hemmingford Home is where Mother Abigail from The Stand lives. Some other King stories that are set in Derry: Secret Window, Secret Garden. You may be familiar with the movie with Johnny Depp, Secret Window. Short story, part of it takes place in Derry. Insomnia, Bag of Bones, Dreamcatcher. Like half of that takes place in Derry. All the main characters in Dreamcatcher are actually kids from Derry. 11/22/63, and the short stories Fair Extension and The Road Virus Heads North. Also, Pennywise does make an appearance in The Tommyknockers. And the last thing I want to mention in our King Easter egg sections is you may notice there are several references to a turtle. And I've got those listed here. We're not going to talk about the turtle. We'll talk about the turtle later. But just as you're reading, if this is your first time, keep your eyes peeled for more references to the turtle. So when Georgie goes down to the basement to get the sealant, he sees some turtle wax. Stan tells Patty that the turtle couldn't help us. And Mike, in his notes, says, maybe it was the voice of the turtle. I'm the only one who still hears the voice of the turtle. And was it blind luck? Or is it that damn turtle again? So, and as we wind down here, we're hitting our last sections. We did have a little bit of homework that I gave you guys. I wanted to know what loser you identified most with as a kid, and who do you identify most with as an adult. Matt, you did mention Richie. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Is that not really? I mean, besides, I mean, it really relates to Richie's. I mean, I've worn glasses since I was in preschool. Growing up, I got bullied a lot, so I used a lot of comedy and jokes and stuff to kind of deflect that, which, I don't know, might be something I feel like a lot of people can relate to.
Or a lot of people that we would run with anyway.
Yeah. But,
it's like half our friend group.
Yeah. I wouldn't say I'm as much like that now. I kind of just have more of a fuck you attitude anymore now. That's pretty basic, but...
Yeah, it doesn't matter if it's basic or not, it's right. And Daniel, what about you?
As a kid, definitely Richie. Couldn't sit still. Used humor as a defense mechanism. I thought I was way funnier than I actually was. Still do.
If you didn't say still do, I was going to.
Thank you. As an adult, I like to identify with Bill more. I'm trying to get a manuscript published. I very much have this fuck you attitude towards certain types of professors that I had. I just like stories to be good stories more than anything else. And most recently, and I've talked to Ryan about this a bunch, my speech impediment has been coming back, along with my stutter recently, and that's something I had
Damn it, Daniel.
I had to go to speech therapy for like 5 years. And for some reason I've started slurring my words again, and I cannot figure out why.
It's probably those 3 empty beers in front of you.
Usually it took more than that, and I guess I'm getting old.
And that's how time works.
Yeah.
So for me, as a kid, Ben was definitely the one I related to the most. I was definitely not an outgoing kid. Not the one to take up the leadership role in the group. I got crushes on girls very easily, very quickly, and very hard. I mean, watching Ben and his crush on Bev in the miniseries as a kid was something I related to heavily. And then I think I wanted to relate to Richie. That was who I wanted to be as a kid. I wanted to be the funny guy, but I wasn't. And then as an adult, I think I relate the most to Mike. Mike is a character who stays in Derry and kind of holds more responsibility for the group and kind of makes the most sacrifices, or maybe you could say he's the only one who makes sacrifices. But that kind of
talk. You sacrificing?
He sacrifices for everyone.
Yeah. I mean, that's just something that any parent can relate to.
Oh, okay. Well, it relate to the kid. I thought you were like talking about us. I was like, what are we doing?
No.
I was like,
that's the type of character I've always related to as an adult. In terms of Star Wars, Obi-Wan stands out to me because he gives up 19 years of his life to sit in the desert and look after this little kid who may or may not be the future of the galaxy. Leia, her entire life is sacrificed up into even her end, where she has to give up her own life so that somebody else can defeat her only son. I mean, there's so much to talk about in terms of sacrifice in Star Wars characters. But yeah, Mike is really who I identify with, and even now as an adult, I'd like it to be Richie, but that's just not my life.
What Star Wars character do you relate to the most, Matt? Why is it Boba Fett?
He looks cool, but inside he's really not.
I was just gonna say R2D2 because sometimes my brain just go. Wah!
Okay, that's a good answer. So you get 5 points.
Also C-3PO because of just a whole big ball of anxiety. We're doomed. And then my question for the listeners, who's your favorite loser and why? Hit us up on our socials. When we wrap this up, you're going to hear all of our socials. Hit us up on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, ask for our Discord link, blah, blah, blah. Just let us know who your favorite loser is. And we have a few recommendations. If you like the It, definitely check out The Body and its film adaptation Stand By Me, Phantoms, Nightmare on Elm Street, Super 8. Daniel, you had a few.
Peter Straub's Floating Dragon might be the book that is most thematically and structurally closest to it that I've read. Shadow over Innsmouth. That's a big one. There's a lot of Lovecraftian influences in this book, especially later on. I think he even name drops Lovecraft a few times.
He normally does at some point in all of his
And
novels. Like Tolkien, Lovecraft, Matheson, Shirley Jackson,
and the Dunwich Horror.
Mm-hmm.
Those three are definitely books that I'd say that if you liked it, here are some things that have some similar kinds of spooks and scares.
Well, thank you for listening. And coming up on the Horror of Babylon next week, on our off week, we're doing an adaptation episode on Firestarter 2 Rekindled, which is the 2-episode miniseries that is a sort of sequel to Sort of sequel. And then the following week, May the 15th, will be our episode on It, Book 2 in the second interlude. The following week, May 22nd, is the release week of the new adaptation of Firestarter, starring Zac Efron. Daniel and I will see that on Friday. We will edit that up on Saturday and release it on Sunday so you can hear our hot, fiery takes on the newest addition to the Firestarter verse. Then the next week, last week of May 29th, we're going to do It Book 3. The first week of June 5th, we are going to be doing Woe, which is the Indian Bollywood adaptation of It.
Dude, you have no clue.
What? That's a thing?
Yeah, it's 100% a thing.
It's 52 episodes long. We're just going to watch the first 2 or 3 episodes.
Wanna watch that?
Sure. Yeah, we'll have you over.
We take drinks every time that drum theme plays.
No, we're not doing that.
Not doing that. June 12th is It Book 4. June 19th is Pennywise, the Story of It, which is the making of documentary of the It miniseries. We are finishing our It novel coverage June 26th with part 5, and then the first week of July we will be doing our episode on It 1990, the miniseries with Tim Curry and John Ritter. And we will give you our July schedule soon. Yes, there will be episodes on both It Chapter 1 and It Chapter 2, but we're not announcing our next book yet. Just keep focusing on It.
50 Shades of Grey.
Well, I've never read it. Is it scary?
I don't make love, I fuck hard.
Is that a line?
That's an actual line, yes.
Is it really?
Yes, 100%.
Christ.
Have you read it?
No, but I am familiar with that.
Well, you just did a whole podcast on It. How have you not read it? Thank you very much for listening tonight. Thank you for joining me, Daniel and Matt.
Dick fish.
All right,
Dick fish.
Thanks, everybody. Stay tuned for our socials and stay scary.
Stay scary.
Well, that was horrendous. I would tell you boys good job, but the dryness of my sarcasm would likely evaporate all the moisture in both your bodies. Anyway, if you want to hear more of this, please subscribe to their YouTube channel by searching for The Horror of Babylon. You can follow them on Twitter at HorrorPod69. The Facebook page is under The Horror of Babylon. And on Instagram, these fools are The Horror of Babylon, one word. Reach their assuredly empty inbox at thehorrorofbabylonpodcast@gmail.com. You can also request their Discord server link via any other channel. And finally, if you are foolish enough to support this abomination financially, search for The Horror of Babylon on patreon.com. And God save your soul if you do.